It's been a while since I tackled any big tanks on my channel, so when Games Workshop sent me this new plastic Fellblade, I knew I needed to give it the 14th Legion treatment. So join me as I tackle a late Heresy Death Guard Fellblade. For the bulk of the build, I would simply follow the instructions on how to build the Fellblade. While I would be making some changes, most of the structure would remain the same. So I began by removing all the parts required to build the sides of the tank that housed the tracks and assembled them. However, I did ignore the instructions when it came to attaching the tracks. These would be much easier to paint if they were kept separate. The bulk of my modifications would come in the form of adding damage. As the setting for my Fellblade is very late in the Horus Heresy, where the Death Guard have begun to fall to Nurgle's blessings, I wanted to create something that lay between the factory fresh and the Death Guard vehicles of the 41st millennium. To represent these on the model, I made good use of my Dremel and started out by adding a long, deep gash to one of the panels. This needed to be both deep and wide enough for me to add some steel ball bearings. You can pick up multi-packs of these quite easily, and I'll link to where I got mine down below. Using a little superglue, I then fixed a few of these into the gap. By differing the sizes, it created the appearance of demonic pustules bursting through the armor, the first signs of the machine spirit being corrupted. To add some shallow pockmarks to the hull, I switched from the cutting tool to a grinding tool and pressed them into the plastic. This left me with some larger points of corrosion that I complemented with some smaller holes. These were formed from various sized drill bits used in both my Dremel and my pin vise. The trick here is to create small, tight groupings using a few different sizes. This will allow you to recreate that common corrosion effect that you see on later Death Guard forces. Following on from the spots of corrosion, I next began to add some dents, scratches and cracks into the hull. To achieve the smaller cut, I used my knife, but the cutting edge of the Dremel made short work of roughing up the edges and adding in those larger gashes. Once I'd built up the damage a little more, I decided to add a small section of plasticard above the boils. I cut out a small rectangle, cut it down to a rough triangle shape, and roughed up the edges a little. I then placed this above the boil so that it created the appearance of the metal being pushed open by the bubonic growth beneath it. To help blend this piece into the rest of the plastic, I applied some of Vallejo's plastic putty. After giving it a chance to fully dry, I then used some fine grit sandpaper to smooth it flat, completing that blend. With one side of the tank complete, I then repeated this process of damage and corrosion to the other side. However, instead of applying the boils to a hole in the armor, I instead glued these to one of the vents. To help seat them in place, I first drilled in some more shallow holes, which also helped to give the effect that they were pushing their way out of the vent. But before we go any further with our build, let's first talk about the sponsors of this video, MyHeritage. A few weeks ago, I did a MyHeritage DNA test, which you can pick up for just $29 or 29 euros using my coupon code PETE. This test was really simple. You just swab your cheek, place it in the vial, package it up, and send it off. You can then use this time to make a start on mapping out your family tree with access to historical records to help fill in those blanks while you wait for your results, which I have right here. Now, I've not checked these yet, and honestly, I'm really curious to see what my results will be, because my dad did a MyHeritage test a while back, and that came back with some Danish ancestry, which was quite a surprise. So I'm interested to see what comes from my mum's side of the family. I believe that her grandparents were Welsh, and I vaguely remember there being mention of some Irish family in there too. Okay, so let's see what the results bring. Okay, so we are 32% Scottish and Welsh. Okay, interesting. That makes sense. Welsh family. 31% English. I'm technically more Scottish and Welsh than I am English. 18% Irish. 6.9% French. Okay, pretty much falls back in line with what I expected. But it's quite surprising to find that I'm more Scottish and Welsh than I'm actually English. So yeah, that was a bit of a surprise, but yeah. It even matched me with other people who had done a MyHeritage DNA test, including my dad, my aunt, and even a few distant cousins who I didn't even know existed. And just so you know, MyHeritage has a strict privacy policy. They will never sell or license your genetic data, and right now, MyHeritage is running a special promotion just for viewers of this video. So, if you've ever wondered about your own heritage, you can get your very own DNA kit for just $29 or 29 euros, which is a lot lower than what you'd find offered by other companies. Click the link in the description or scan the QR code and use the coupon code PETE to grab yours. With both sides of the tank complete, I could continue assembling the rest of the hull, adding more damage as I went. For my next piece of damage, I wanted to make a nod to the exposed guts of the Plague Marines by adding some exposed cabling through the hull of the Fellblade. The cabling was sourced from the Foetid Bloat-Drone, but it did need to be clipped down quite heavily. After a quick comparison against the hull to determine where to make the hole, I used my Dremel to open up the hull. Repeating the corrosion effects from earlier, I then glued some more holes around the main one. These built up to create the effect of the hull having rotted through. Once the hole was complete, I checked the cable again, made further adjustments, and once things were fitting properly, glued the cable into place. This was followed up by a second cable. I did have to enlarge the hole a little more to help it to fit, but once the second pipe was in place, I continued to build up the rest of the tank as per the instructions, adding damage as I went. When it came to the turret, I wanted to add a hint of more mutations beginning to form. Before gluing on the top panel of the rear stowage bins, I first sawed away the two lids from the panel in order to separate them. After cleaning up the cuts, I then used some pliers to carefully blend up the inner corner of each lid. This was followed up with further damage before gluing them to the bins, leaving me with a gap. This was filled in with some writhing tentacles taken from the Beast of Nurgle kit. All of this combined to create the appearance of a Nurglish corruption starting to take corporeal form. With the turret complete for the time being, I turned my attention to the fuel tanks mounted to the back of the hull. Repeating the steps that I employed on the vent earlier, I added further pustules to the tanks, as well as my usual damage and corrosion. While I still had the Beast of Nurgle kit handy, I sourced a few of the dripping pieces of slime and glued these to the barrels, creating the effect of some putrid ichor beginning to leak out. A design motif common on Heresy era Death Guard are vents and grating. To represent this, I used another newly released kit, the MK2 Assault Marines. Their jump packs are an ideal source of these details, but do require a bit of cutting down to separate the vent and the exhaust. With a few of these removed, the larger vents were attached to the side panels and to the top of the turret. The smaller vents were also attached around the lower points on the turret. These all combined to create a system that may have originally been designed to filter out toxic gases, but now emanate airborne contagions. For my tank's commander, I started out with the basic miniature that came with the kit and attached a couple of arms. However, for shoulder pads, I dipped into the Plague Marine kit and topped him off with a resin Death Guard Mark 6 helmet. My next modification was to add some thick, billowing clouds of putrid smoke to the exhaust at the rear of the Fellblade. These were also sourced from the Foetid Bloat-Drone kit, but first needed to be clipped away from their original vents. After I trimmed down the bottom of each smoke section, I glued them to the exhaust. But before I began the painting, I had one final addition, and that was this corrosion texture paste from AK Interactive. Normally this kind of thing is added as part of the painting process, but as I wanted to create that effect of rust bubbling up through the paint, it had to be done first. I focused my application predominantly around the bottom of the hull, an area that would both accrue more dirt and grime, but also where water and corrosion would pool. I also built up the texture across the spots of corrosion, into the recesses, and at the end of the weapon barrels. With everything complete, I added my tank tracks to some bamboo holders with some double-sided tape and mounted the sponsons and commander to 20mm bases. All of these made priming and painting much easier. Speaking of the primer, I tackled everything with some Colorforge primers. The turret was coated with Death Rattle, the sponsons, tracks and main cannon Raven Black, and I used my very own Dead Animal Bit spray to achieve that classic bone colour. With the primers in place, I was ready to kick off the painting. Now, if you've already seen my Death Guard Praetor painting guide, you'll already be familiar with these steps, but there were a few minor changes. To add some depth to the bone white armour and to make the details pop, I went with a bit of dry brushing, starting out with some Ivory Tusk from the Tooth and Coats range that I added to my palette. After just slightly dampening my brush, I worked the paint into the bristles with a circular motion. Once the brush was evenly loaded, I applied it to the armour with light, sweeping motions over the Dead Animal Bits base coat. As the paint slowly came off the brush, it created some nice soft blends between the base coat and the lighter colour. This technique also naturally picked up the raised edges and finer details, which was exactly what I was after. Next up, I continued the dry brushing on the turret using some green Beret. For this, I tried to focus on the upper part of the turret, leaving the lower sections darker. This would work together with some later weathering to create a more realistic lighting effect. I then took a short break from the dry brushing to paint in a few of the details. These were base coated with some Death Reaper, which nicely matched the colour of the Raven Black primer. This was used predominantly across the viewports, hull weapons, optics, and other smaller details. With the Death Reaper base coat in place, I continued by dry brushing on some Dungeon Stone Grey over the top, followed by another slightly lighter coat of Wizard Grey just to pick out those heightened edges and corners. With the dry brushing complete, I continued picking out those details with further base coats. The first of these were the tentacles from the back of the turret, which I used Barbarian Brawn. For the bronze details, like the vents, shoulder pads, and exhaust, I used some Steampunk Copper, before painting up the plumes of smoke with Wolf Grey. For the boils growing out of the hull, I hit everything with some Sun Bleach Yellow, and painted some of those lenses and optics with Sanguine Scarlet. My final base coat was Troll Snot Green, and this was used to paint the oozing ichor from the fuel tanks. And with that, all of my base coats were complete, but I was far from done. I next had to tackle the decals and weathering, and to do both of these, I would need to give the whole model a coat of gloss varnish. This would not only seal in my current paintwork, but it would also create a smoother surface that is much better for applying transfers and streaks of grime to. I sourced my decals from the Death Guard, Legion, and Fellblade transfer sheets. Once they've been cut out, they were dipped into some water with a few drops of microset added in. This just helps to loosen the transfer from the paper and means you only need to hold your transfer in the water for a few seconds to soak. Once they were lifting away from the backing paper, I used a dampened brush to gently slide the transfers onto the hull of the tank. While they were still damp, I adjusted their position before leaving them to dry. Once they had dried, I then applied a few layers of microsol. This softens the transfer and allows it to more easily adhere to the shape and texture of the surface that you're applying it to. I applied a couple of layers of this, allowing each layer to dry fully before applying more. Once I'd finished my application of microsol and the decals had dried, I then sealed them in place with another coat of gloss varnish. Which brought me neatly to the weathering. This was kicked off by recreating the decals and markings being worn away. This was achieved by lightly sponging on paint over the top of the markings. For those of the turret, I used Gung-Ho Green, and for the rest of the hull, I used Griffon Claw. This slowly broke up the surface, creating that worn look. For the rest of the weathering, I switched over to the Pro Acryl range and bought out the Noosh. This is an acrylic medium that really slows down the drying time so you can easily wipe away or adjust your paint. Basically, it gives you all the benefits of an oil wash without having to deal with the messy oil paints and thinners. I mixed the first paint into the medium, which was some dark umber, also from the Pro Acryl range. Noosh works particularly well with highly pigmented paints, which the PA range definitely is. After mixing the paint into the medium, I applied a generous layer of the mix across the armor before using a dampened glass cleaning cloth to wipe away the excess. This left the paint in and around the recesses, creating the look of grime, grease, and other nasty fluids gathering here. It also darkened those recessed areas, which made the raised edges and details really stand out. I found it easiest to work on one section at a time, since even though Noosh has a long work time, it's easy to focus on a single area before moving on to the next. Next, I added some coal black to the Noosh. This time I applied the mix more directly into some of the recesses instead of washing it across entire surfaces. This let me specifically focus on darkening and emphasizing key details like the vents, scratches, and corroded parts. To create some rust effects, I used burnt orange and applied it across various points on the model, focusing on those corroded spots where I'd added the texture paste. In addition to these details, I also applied a few spots to the panels of the armor before dragging a slightly damp brush downwards across it. This left behind some realistic looking streaks of rust. To create a verdigris effect on the bronze areas of the model, I made use of some bright jade. Again, I focused this application more directly into the recesses and divots. Across the oozing ichor, I used a mixture of yellow-green and burnt umber, before I added some plum to the recesses of the boils. My final Noosh mix was dog flesh, and this was used across the tentacles. With all of the weathering complete, I decided to pick out a few specific details with some highlights. For the bronze details, I used some Heirloom Gold, and for the areas painted with Dark Reaper and Raven Black, I switched to the graphite. I simply dragged some sticks of graphite across the raised details, which left a dark silvery sheen. The result was a dulled metal look that complemented the patches of bright orange rust nicely. At this point, my painting was complete and I was able to assemble everything, removing them from the holders, scraping clean the contact points, and adding a little glue. With everything complete, I gave everything one final coat of matte varnish to lock in that weathering step and dull down some of the glossiness from the earlier varnish coats, which left me with this. And here we have my completed Fellblade of the Death Guard. As I mentioned at the beginning of this video, my aim here was to create something that had that touch of Nurgle corruption. While hints of corruption are small, there are just a taste of the dark gifts that lay along the path that the Legion is now on. Now, even if you're not interested in the kitbashing side of things, the paint scheme I've employed for this miniature would be perfectly usable for early Heresy Death Guard forces too. Just tone back the weathering until you're happy with the result. As always, I'll include a list to all the parts and paints used in this video down in the description below, along with where you can pick them up from. And once again, a big thank you to MyHeritage for sponsoring this video. And if you've ever wondered about your own heritage, now is a great time to find out for only $29 or €29. Just click the link in the description or scan the QR code and use the coupon code PETE to grab yours. And before I go, let me say a huge thank you to everyone who continues to help keep the channel going. And if you'd like to support me too, you can get early access to ad-free videos, exclusive merchandise, and even your name in the credits. Simply follow my Patreon link below or hit the join button, just like my top Patreon supporters did, who are Nail5, Andrew Butler, Andrew Marston, Banyevrian, Berserker, Dakota Kaburi, Daniel Dowling, George Kanzini Roberts, Immaterial Creations, Cornbread, Little Templar, Matt J. Savitsky, Matt Mini Minute, Molly Mork, Older Than Time, Sam Sulfavida, Swedsman, and Tim. And my top channel members who are Andrew Chell, Bon Johnson, Chris Toomey, Stobox, Daniel Reese, Dave, Doug H, Dwarf of War, Guy Bizant, John Gibbs, Kaiser Waffle 11, Mark Taylor, Misa Pogon, Durnington Paint, Omnitom, Patrick K, Philip Poyer, Ryan O'Shaughnessy, SO, SJ Carper, Tactical Batman, The Sire Acquired, Tylo, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.